In the 1920s, mass transit became a very important part of American culture. People had more money and more time to travel around. The different ways of transportation included boats, trains, cars, airplanes, and trolleys.
The first streetcars, or trolleys, was the earliest form of mass transit. The streetcars rolled along special steel rails that were placed in the middle of the street. The streetcars were much larger and carried more passengers than horse-drawn buggies, which allowed them to be effective. Airplanes weren't 100% safe yet because they had just become invented, and cars were so expensive that only rich people could afford them, so trains became a very important part of travel. Even though cars wasn't an important part of transportation at the time, it was a very important part in The Great Gatsby. Cars were the newest way for people to get around the city in a comfortable and more luxurious way. Cars were also a symbol of the American dream, since the American dream is to obtain wealth, and cars were a symbol of that. Tom and Gatsby both had cars to show that they were rich. Gatsby especially had so many cars because he tried to show Daisy his wealth. One of the cars he had was a Rolls Royce. The car was a place in The Great Gatsby where both the train tracks and the cars would drive through was the Valley of Ashes. This place was located at This is where the Valley of Ashes is located on a map. This is an interpretation of what the Valley of Ashes may have looked like in The Great Gatsby. In The Great Gatsby, there are many occasions where trains are used to travel from one place to another. One occasion is when Tom and Myrtle meet. Myrtle recalls,
I was on a train to New York to see Catherine spend the night. And Tom was sitting opposite me. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I could see he was a real gentleman. I couldn't keep my eyes off him. Every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head.
in this scene, Tom and Myrtle meet for the first time. This also showed how both the poor and the rich ride the train, since Tom was a rich man and Myrtle was a poor woman. Another occasion of people taking the train is in Chapter 8 when Nick misses the first train and then the second train to take to get back to the city, but instead stayed with Gatsby. In the next chapter, when Nick sent Meyer Wolfsheim a letter telling him to come back to the city to see Gatsby's funeral, he told him to get on the next train. Taking a train, besides taking a car, was the only way to get to the Valley of Ashes. The Valley of Ashes is where Nick and Myrtle meet. Nick recalls, also, by being one of the few ways to get to the Valley of Ashes, and to the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, who according to George symbolizes God, shows how important trains were during that time period if it was one of the few ways to see God. The Valley of Ashes may have looked like it did because during this time period, American industrialization was happening, which would cause deposits of pollution to form places like the Valley of Ashes. The pollution coming from the trains and cars that were going through the Valley of Ashes could have helped cause it to become that way as well. Trains are also discussed near the end of the book, where Nick talks about how he was taking a train back to his home in Minnesota. As he thinks about this, he realizes that he is a Westerner and that the life and wealth that he was trying to have in New York was not going to work out for him. Boats were also an important part of transportation during this time, but were also a way for rich people to have fun. In The Great Gatsby, Gatsby's guests were driving. The motorboats, like the automobiles, were for the rich people since they were the only ones who could afford them at the time. Boats were also used to transport people across the oceans, such as Tom and Myrtle when they went on their honeymoon on the seas, because they traveled by boat. No matter what type of transportation people were using at the time to get around, whether trolleys, boats, cars, airplanes, or even trains, mass transportation was very important during this time.